Welcome to the TELSIG podcast. I'm Phil Martin from the University of York. I'm joined in the studio today by Dr. Zoe Handley, also from the University of York. So Zoe, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
English tutors' knowledge, beliefs and practice regarding the use of AI. You've just done a research project on this, which I'd like to get into for a little bit, but You've also been monitoring the state of technology in language teaching and education in general for the past 20 years or so. So
that's right, yeah.
Very well placed to talk about all the things that will be of interest to our audience. So can you give us a bit of a background, first of all? What's the story? How did you get to where you are at the moment?
I guess I come to this as a language learner who used technology to learn languages. So unusually, I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology. So it was a BSc in languages, which is a bit strange. But essentially what we were doing was we were studying language and linguistics alongside other students who were studying artificial intelligence and computational linguistics. So what this meant was that the studies that we were doing about linguistics were very much geared up to working in that industry, to developing speech and language technologies. But also, we had modules where we were using the speech and language technologies. So we were looking at them as users. But also our tutors as well were teaching us language through the use of technology. So thinking about kind of intelligent tutoring systems, the early kind of versions of those where you would get automated feedback, but it was more kind of template based. It had to be programmed by the tutor versus today where you might be kind of harnessing ChatGPT or something to automatically generate the feedback from the student. So that's kind of where I started out and first became aware of the potential for technology and AI for language learning. I then moved on to do a PhD at the same institution. So I did my PhD on speech synthesis for language learning. So specifically text-to-speech synthesis. The idea was, so that was in around about the year 2000, 2001, where there was the previous big advance in AI, specifically speech and language technologies. And with respect to speech synthesis, we'd moved from rule-based hand-programmed systems to systems where what we were doing was taking recordings of human speaking, then chopping them up and rearranging that to make new kind of messages. And this new technology meant that we had more human-sounding voices. They were also smoother than, say, if you remember, is it Speak and Spell, that kind of technology back then that was very robotic sounding. So it became very natural. And at the same time, speech recognition. So the technology that gives a computer the ability to hear, that also had advanced as well, moving from kind of word spotting systems to systems that could deal with very large vocabularies and a much wider range of voices. And this was because, again, they were starting to use statistical techniques. So I've kind of, since then, I worked building these kind of systems at Toshiba. And I've engaged with the different potential uses of those technologies in language learning. It's not really until recently, though, that I've come back to that because there's been this real shift in the capacities of those technologies. Speech recognition can recognize an even wider range of voices, speech synthesis even smoother and can generate different voices. And then obviously you've got ChatGPT that can automatically generate texts.
So what were the big milestones in the development of these technologies where it really started to change the way we teach and the way we learn languages specifically?
So I'm not sure I would say there are big milestones in how it's changed the way in which we teach and learn languages. I'm not convinced that these technologies have really entered classrooms yet. So the earlier technologies, so when I was working on this in the early to mid 2000s, that was when it became possible. You started to get things like Hourlog and Rosetta Stone, these full-scale programs that you could use to learn a language. But those weren't widely used. It's only more recently that the technology's been kind of, I guess the cost of the technology has come down and it's more available to the wider population. So you would have had to pay for programs then, Whereas with the release of ChatGPT and other generative AI technologies that generate text, but also can be used to have conversations like a chatbot, these are now available freely to anyone. And you've also at the same time got things like Duolingo. They're offering language learning free of charge. They've got a particular model of funding where they're offering language learning free of charge. And again, those are underpinned by AI technologies as well. Increasingly, so AI is used, I believe, to generate the examples. It's also used for the learning analytics as well. So to tailor the choice of activities and drills and grammar drills to the level of the learner. But not just that, they also use it to tailor the motivational message. So essentially, I think you could probably use a better word than harvesting, but essentially they're harvesting the learner's data to understand what are their patterns of interaction. And based on that, what motivational messages are going to keep them engaged and keep them engaged and keep them learning using that platform. You asked me what's the big change been there. I think the change is in the underpinning technology. So the underpinning technology, the reason that these systems are much better now is they've managed to harness all that data that's out there, all that language data. The data that's generated, for example, through social media, through us using various Google applications. Computing power has also increased, so the power of specifically graphical processing units, and then bringing that together with actually artificial neural networks are actually a really old technology. They were talking about artificial neural networks in texts I was reading in the late 1990s, but it wasn't feasible to apply those until now, where we've got the data, we've got the processing power, and now we've got this advance as well. Because we've got that, we can now have what they call deep neural networks. So these neural networks have got many more layers to them. So when I was working on speech recognition technologies, I was working for Toshiba in the mid-2000s. Their speech recognition was based on two models. A model of what phoneme was likely to come next if you'd recognized the current phoneme, and if those phonemes made up this word, what word is most likely to come next? Whereas now, these systems have many, many more parameters. And therefore, when it comes to text generation and also speech recognition, it's able to model longer range dependencies. So it's able to model that. But it also, I hesitate to use the word understand, because these understanding is not encoded into these systems. It's got a better, understanding is not the right word, but it can capture more relationships between words. So effectively the semantic relationships through knowing what words co-occur, but not necessarily immediately next, the immediately preceding or following word, but these longer range dependencies as well.
Cool. So you talked a bit about the apps. So most of us are familiar with Duolingo, Busuu, and your article you wrote quite recently had a look at some of these apps. I'll link to some of these below as well in the show notes. And I think, so your article was about whether these apps will replace teachers, which was a tantalizing headline to put on there. I think you, we'll be mostly familiar with these as applications. We've noticed how, Duolingo does, as you say, it sort of learns your behavioral patterns and is able to kind of like target its instruction to some extent. What have the other applications been around the use of this technology? So that, I mean, that's, this is fantastic. I mean, I've benefited from it as well with these targeted instructions.
I've tried Duolingo as well. And so maybe just to clarify that Duolingo, I think, incorporates AI in a number of different ways. So you've got it using the AI to automatically generate the examples. That's why some of the examples, the silly examples you get from Duolingo, that's because that seems to have long used generative AI. So this technology that can automatically generate text from a prompt. It also integrates, it must be integrating speech recognition for the evaluation in some of the pronunciation activities. It's also integrating the learning analytics for this kind of adaptive learning and for the motivational messages. But also more recently, it's been suggested it's going to harness ChatGPT to be able to provide feedback on grammar, which is one of the other applications that this technology has long been used for. So if you think of your spelling and grammar checker in Word, actually that is underpinned just by a previous generation of AI. And so building on spelling and grammar checkers, you have what they call automated writing evaluation. So tools like Grammarly that provide sort of more feedback than you would have previously got from Word on your grammar and your punctuation, your spelling, your coherence. And then in addition to that, slightly different. So automated writing evaluation, there are kind of two forms, the Grammarly, which is more like your formative feedback. And then you can have it used for summative as well. So some of the big assessment providers are starting to use these technologies to automatically assess students. So they are basically what these technologies use is different characteristics of the text. It carries out an analysis of the linguistic characteristics of the text, and those are mapped to human ratings. So basically, you've got an algorithm that's trained on sort of the relationship between these different measures that the computer can make of the text. So that might be linguistic diversity. It might be the grammatical complexity of the sentences. And then you run an algorithm to see which combination and weighting of those measures predicts the human rating. And so that's how you get automated writing evaluation. And that's also being used for speech evaluation as well. Though in that sense, I think that's only currently used more as a formative tool. So I know TOEFL for the IBT, they were looking at this, but I don't believe it's been rolled out for for the summative high stakes evaluation. And there are very good reasons for this when you think about policies on data processing. So thinking about UK GDPR, the use of automated tools to make decisions, assessment is a decision. And so rightly, people might question if they were being evaluated by an automated tool. I think there were some other things I might have talked about in that article. So for historically, Rosetta Stone, Auralog have used automatic speech recognition to provide feedback on pronunciation. So in terms of these, they can give sort of an overall evaluation, those kind of models would have been developed in the same way I just described for the writing evaluation. And they can also be used to provide diagnostic feedback. And what's interesting about those tools, or what I find particularly interesting and something that perhaps could be developed, there was some really good work out of Edinburgh in the mid-90s on this sort of thing, is how you can present the automated feedback visually in a way that learners can understand. So you often see what sort of pitch contours, pitch tunnels, but also you less see things like vowel targets. So there are different ways that you could kind of visually represent the feedback that could be used to enhance these technologies. And there is a history of research there, but that's not quite there yet.
How are they giving feedback at the moment?
So the last time I looked at these, there were so one of the things that they enable is what they call, they were effectively branching dialogues. And I don't think they've really gone beyond that. They might look like they're not branching dialogues, but the context is so constrained that it's a branching dialogue. And so in one sense, the feedback is kind of the real world interaction. Was your interaction successful? Beyond those kind of branching dialogues, there might be activities that focus on pronunciation of specific words and specific sentences. Historically, what they've had is a kind of, effectively, it's a graph that represents your pitch throughout the utterance. And basically, they'll show you your pitch and the comparison with a model. And you might get a score, but the challenge there is that the huge individual variation, whether actually the individual can match that model. And certainly, when we've been looking at these technologies, before I was working with Canadian speakers of French, their the contours didn't match the model. The same with, so the other feedback would be a waveform. So the waveform is effectively the intensity of time by the intensity of the speech. So what you can see there is you can see kind of the syllables, the vowels, and that those are basically, you can kind of see the rhythm of the speech. But again, the problem with these is, do the learners understand what those visualizations represent and how to use that feedback? Another one, and I think this might be integrated more into tools for speech and language therapy rather than language learning, but it could be used for language learning, is the measurements that you can kind of automatically make of speech. You can convert them into effectively a vowel chart, so the vowel quadrilateral. And then based on data gathered from a large population, you can create kind of regions or highlight regions, which are the target. They're like, well, if you're producing this like a native speaker, your vowel should fall within this region. And then they would represent, this is the region where the kind of native speakers fall, and this is where you are. And that could give you some feedback. I think that could be more informative, because actually if you knew, or if tutors who are supporting learners knew how the vowel quadrilateral worked, you could translate that into articulatory instructions, because effectively the different formants, so the resonances of the vocal tract, relate to different positions of like tongue heights and things like that.
Yeah, I got to admit, I wasn't actually aware of much of that, because I had I briefly saw a couple of presentations about how these language learning apps could complement sort of traditional classroom-based instruction on languages. And I think what you're talking about there, it strikes me as being potentially useful, because pronunciation feedback is so, it's quite a difficult thing to give on a class basis. The last time I remember doing, also about 20 years ago, some one of the early language teacher training courses, and they talked about choral drilling and things like that. But yeah, that's what you might call a blunt instrument. I think
so absolutely. The thing, if you're thinking about AI and technology, even educational technology more broadly, where I would think of placing it in the curriculum is that untiring personal tutor. And also not just untiring, but we'd say non-judgmental. That said, I had an interaction with a social robot a few weeks ago, and it wasn't programmed to be non-judgmental. So we have to not make these assumptions about technology. But essentially, I think that the way in which to harness these technologies for language learning is language learning requires practice to identify the parts of the curriculum where you really, really need practice and individualized practice like pronunciation. And then that's what we should be getting the automated tutors to support. And then the more human elements of social interaction, conversation. Yes, these tools can also provide some untiring practice, maybe to bring down learners' anxiety levels. But essentially, that needs to happen with human interlocutors.
Right. The one thing that I thought was interesting about this might have been a statistic in your article, not even a statistic. Sorry, edit this bit. It was a statement about the fact that Duolingo could, in theory, substitute a semester or something of language instruction by, what was it, 34 hours, something like that. And the interesting thing about, I don't know if that was ascribed to Duolingo, but if it was, the interesting thing I've noticed about Duolingo is it doesn't give any explicit grammar feedback or anything like that. I remember when I was using it, I was like, well, where's the tuition? And all this, so you're basically making all your progress through control practice, instant feedback, and error correction, without any kind of explicit instruction on the underlying theories of language. And for any of us learning things like, one of the Slavic languages or something with case systems, these generally, I think there's been a perception that these require an explanation from a qualified tutor. And there's also been certainly within English language teaching, we've always held onto the belief that explicit grammar instruction is necessary. I believe this has been borne out.
I would say not just necessary, but also more efficient. So if you look at some articles, I'm not thinking about grammar here, but thinking about vocabulary instruction. If you look at, I think there's a Nation article where he estimates how long it would take you to learn vocabulary through kind of extensive reading, that actually you need kind of this intensive instruction, but also explicit instruction is going to be it's going to be more efficient and quicker.
Yeah. And I think with the traditional language classroom, we don't use translation, whereas some of these apps do. So they would present, they make the target and source language work in tandem, and you can see you're learning the semantic meaning of each word through translation, which obviously we don't do in a classroom. It's usually carried out in the target language. So there are some slightly different methods going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So it does feel that some of the claims and some of the methods are not in line with our, the broader thinking in the field. That said, I do think Duolingo, for example, they have quite an extensive research team. And if I were going to do kind of research in this area, and actually something I'd really like to do is to adopt the Duolingo research method in a sense, because what they do to kind of refine the design of their app and refine their understanding of how people learn a language is that they're constantly running what they call A/B testing. So they'll kind of, I guess they'd have a branch off their current best version of the software where they would implement some other form of learning, some other approach to pronunciation teaching. I know they were advertising for people to do work on high variability pronunciation teaching, which is a perceptual approach to pronunciation teaching. So what they would do is they'd have a kind of a separate version of the software that they roll out to a set of users, and they evaluate whether that's better than the current version of the software. And the approach is that, at least I've seen them advertising for roles where it's clear that they were planning to implement approaches that are grounded in psycholinguistic research on language learning, for example. There are maybe some conflicts with our intuition about what works, but I guess we also have to remember that their context in which they're working in is perhaps the informal language learner who hasn't got a tutor there. And the easiest way for them to access the language is via a translation. And I guess we also need to remember they're trying to develop this for multiple languages as well. This is not a tutor with a class who all share the same language as well. I know obviously that EAP classes often have diverse learners in though.
Mm. Yeah, well, that's quite a tour of the underlying technologies in your backgrounds. I wanted to jump in now to your project at the moment on beliefs and practices, and I think there was that we've covered this in a couple of podcast episodes. A couple back, we discussed with Michael Groves and Klaus Mundt were on the show talking about the work they've done in machine translation. And I asked earlier about the milestone. I remember one of them mentioned for them, milestone, I think, was certainly as teachers of language, was around 2015. I think that's what they said, when they were faced with some student work, which, was way beyond what they knew them to be able to produce. They said, how did you do this? And the student said, well, I used Google Translate. And they were saying, well, no, you can't have done this. The technology is just not there. It was a bit of a joke. The poor quality of the translation was almost comical. And it was at that point that they became interested in following this and started to sort of write and research about this more deeply and follow the progress of the technology. So we had this moment around 2015-16, where certainly language teachers, I think, we at the vanguard of this, we start to become concerned about things like attribution when it comes to assessments, students' voice, the asking more philosophical questions about the extent to which, this is someone's work, if they use these increasingly sophisticated translation tools. And this sort of fed into calls for policy, more research into how do teachers, how do practitioners, how do lecturers in non-language teaching subjects feel about students using these tools to mediate their writing. And now increasingly we're seeing them use it to mediate their understanding as well. We've got real-time translation happening in class via apps and everything. So I think this is, really interesting field to be looking at. What do people believe about it? And we do have the ever-present call for policy, although I'm not entirely convinced anyone actually knows what that would look like. So yeah, that's just the context. So pick up on that where you will, but just where are you with your project, and what were your motivations for this?
So I was going to say my motivations. So my motivations broadly for looking at teachers' beliefs and practices, so their kind of practical pedagogical knowledge, is because AI in particular, but educational technology as a field moves at such a pace that you can't evaluate technologies and their effectiveness in traditional ways. So there would be, I have colleagues who want me to do an RCT, a randomized control trial of, it'd be great to do a randomized control trial of a particular app. But for me, no one app is a panacea. It's not going to solve all of our problems. Different apps are going to encode different approaches to learning and are going to solve different parts of learning. And so for me, thinking about kind of the levels of digital maturity in schools, so I'm thinking about kind of secondary schools, I felt that the best way to spread digital maturity is actually there are teachers out there using effective practices, using these tools. And so actually what we need to do is we need research on teachers' practical pedagogical knowledge. What tools are they using? Why? How? And how do they know they're effective? So while some wouldn't claim that the kind of evidence you get from teacher thinking is strong evidence, I think there are ways in which you can work with teachers to understand whether what they're doing is working. So by asking them, well, why do you think it is working? And eliciting that kind of knowledge from them. So that's one of the reasons that I'm doing this, is because I think it's a good source of evidence of what works. And also, I think that source of evidence is more likely to be accepted by teachers than us as researchers who don't work as practicing teachers, designing an intervention, putting it in the classroom and evaluating it and then saying, right, use this. That's not going to be, you're not going to get the same uptake. So that's why I'm interested in teachers thinking. I'm also interested in it because I think there needs to be more critical thinking about educational technology. So I did a systematic review of EdTech for English language teaching, but that was more at the kind of, again, secondary school kind of level. I think I published it in 2012. And what was notable there was even the people publishing the research were often saying, well, we're evaluating this technology because we should be using technology. There's this kind of imperative to use technology, rather than thinking about how does this technology help us either create conditions that support learning, or engage learners in processes that support learning. So those kind of the reasons that I'm doing it. And my focus is on understanding how we can harness technology to support learning. That said, the current project that you described, while I come at this as someone who sees these technologies as something that can support language learning, inevitably tutors talked about assessment because, well, we've now got a technology, ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, all of these different generative AI tools, which from a prompt can effectively generate an essay. And there is research out there. So there's a recent study by Reading University where they tried to infiltrate the assessment system. And that research demonstrates that these essays can achieve pass standard. The tutors don't notice any difference between those essays and those produced by their own students. So the results, so I talked to some EAP tutors, and essentially the discussion focused on the assessment policy. And I think I can't quite remember what you said, but alluded to, well, what does this policy look like? The essential message is it's toothless. We can't enforce it. So there are some institutions that started outright banning it, others highly constraining the use of the technology. We're moving towards, so if we're thinking of actual principles, tutors were really talking about the writing process, talking about authorship, talking about to what extent using the AI tool for this part of the reading and writing process that leads up to submitting that assignment involves the student's own work, that demonstrates their own abilities. And kind of intertwined with that is kind of an issue of there was agreement about, yeah, you can use this to brainstorm. Yes, you can use this to proofread, but some of the other processes in between were less mentioned, and therefore I assume there's less agreement about them, or they were kind of debated. So, does getting an idea of a structure, does that constitute academic misconduct? For some, they felt that would be academic misconduct. For others, they didn't. And I think this depends on your understanding of what it means to do academic writing. For me, that would be academic misconduct. The structure is the argumentation. How you organize and put together the ideas, that is that's where your input, your critical thinking comes. That's one element of it. So, the policy, where the policy is at, is that it's often underdeveloped. There are huge questions about whether it's, whether we can even enforce these policies. And in terms of what's underpinning them, it's this question of authorship. And then kind of on the other hand, you've got people working, saying, well, we just can't do those forms of assessment now. Let's think about other forms of assessment, whether this be oral examinations, sit-down exams, or is it that we look at the process? So by requiring students to submit draft work, then effectively we're ruling out the AI. But as some of the tutors rightly said, every alternative you suggest, there is an AI tool you could probably use to support you to do that task and to make it easier. And it's just such a moving landscape as well that, it's ever evolving, that really, at least my personal view is, we should be thinking about a more nuanced approach where maybe for some assessments they can't use AI. Like traditionally on a language program, there were assessments where you could use dictionaries and others where you didn't. In addition to that, those assessments where they are allowed to use AI, actually, our job is to equip students for their life beyond the university, where they will be able to use these technologies. And effectively, they are our new writing strategies. At least that's the way that I see it.
Yeah, I mean, a few things in there that what you said. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that something that I heard being discussed on the Learning Development podcast as well. So quick shout out to them. But they were talking about the importance of writing as a learning tool and how important it is I guess it's the quintessential form of assessment for learning is to write. And it's almost become a cliche to say that, I write to know what I think. And, it makes you...
I say that all the time. Writing is thinking is what I say to my PhD students all the time.
Yeah. But at the same time, as a means of assessment, if you want to get a genuine snapshot of a student's ability to understand certain material or their grasp of certain concepts, a take-home essay just isn't feasible anymore to do that. So I'm not sure. It's less about policy and more about kind of incentives and what direction we want to go in and how we present this material to students.
That's what I've been thinking about is how do we, so I've come up against exactly the problem that you talked about that language teachers were coming up against, recognizing the role of machine translation. So obviously I saw it in the classroom this year, the kind of, they wanted me to live caption myself. They were using automated translation, but actually I was realizing that some of the assignments, dissertations that we're receiving are written using machine translation. And it's raised my awareness of sort of questioning the extent to which within academic misconduct training, students are being introduced to these technologies, explained how they work. And crucially, I think we need to raise their awarenesses of their strengths and limitations and what it is these technologies cannot do, so that they understand that actually, if they rely on these, and if they over-rely on these, what they're actually missing out. I don't think a stick is going to work because we simply can't enforce it. We need to be thinking about kind of awareness raising. I don't know about incentives, whether there are any incentives. Certainly actually learning and achieving that mastery yourself, you would hope would be the incentive. But that's not always the kind of the motivational orientation that our students come with. Certainly the tutors were reporting that so many of our students are instrumentally motivated. They just want a degree at the end of this. It's not about, for them, about the learning, about achieving the linguistic abilities. So I think, first of all, maybe raising their awareness that it's not going to help them achieve the high grade they want without understanding how to use it well. And that's a skill in itself. And then, the motivational orientations, maybe that's something we need to work on as well.
When you talked to teachers and they talked about the use of tech, just the, sort of assessment aside and thinking about just as a means of teaching, did you get a sense that a lot of teachers were they able to provide specific rationales for why they would use certain pieces of tech? Just jumping back to a bit you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. So I think what was really interesting about the group that I interviewed for this particular project. So these are EAP tutors working at universities. I suspect this is quite a unique sample of tutors. Within that sample, about half had a master's in applied linguistics, were studying for a PhD. So what came through in the interviews was often quite frequent references to a range of different theories of learning, including multimedia learning theory. They were clearly aware of depth of processing, those kind of theories. And that's not... So I think we'd have to be very cautious, sort of thinking that what I found, the understandings or the thinking that I found in these tutors would maybe translate to those working in secondary schools. Because if you compare the amount of kind of pedagogical and theoretical knowledge that these tutors had with the amount of sort of more pedagogical in the form of thinking about processes of learning that someone doing a PGCE to go into a school has, there's a vast difference. It's talking to PGCE tutors, it's quite limited, that kind of pedagogic knowledge that a school teacher might have. So when we think about actually training teachers to develop the skills to use technology, normally I'd be advocating for a pedagogy first approach. Let's start thinking about pedagogy. Let's upskill teachers in their pedagogical understanding and then get them to think about how the affordances, the features of a technology might be used to implement those theories, to implement those pedagogies. Whereas with EAP tutors, I think it's highly likely that a lot of them have got advanced degrees in linguistics or applied linguistics, and therefore they've got the foundational pedagogical knowledge. It's more about upskilling them with the technical knowledge and reminding them to draw those links with the understanding of how people learn and the conditions we need in place for learning to happen.
But it's interesting. You don't even have to go outside of higher education. We go back to people in secondary schools and holding PGCEs. But if you look at other English for academic purposes, it's always interesting because a lot of them, they have applied linguistics degrees. And when you do an applied linguistics degree, it often has teaching components in it. So it's this marriage of linguistic theory and teaching, which is quite unusual because when you look at other departments, we suddenly refer to them as SMEs, subject matter experts. And subject matter experts are teachers by dint of their expert in the subject. But there are no doubt cases where their primary interest is their subject matter, pedagogical knowledge. If it's there, it's probably largely acquired through practice of delivering lectures and perhaps being tuned into what works.
It's limited to PG Cap, which is the frustration in education departments that, we have to do PG Cap, but there's not actually that huge amount of pedagogical content. And that's what we do. We teach people that. But obviously, you've got that issue in a broader university, beyond education departments, beyond EAP tutors, that the level of pedagogical knowledge is perhaps not there. What I think, though, is really good now is that our learning technologists, those teams, those learning technologists tended to come with technical knowledge. It was very clear for me, particularly within the pandemic, when we had to make that shift very rapidly online, I was so pleased to see the seminal sort of speakers on online kind of remote digital online teaching and their frameworks being cited, and actually tutors being given the pedagogical tools or the pedagogical frameworks to help them start to teach with technology online. So I'm thinking here about Gilly Salmon's framework for doing online discussions and that kind of distance learning.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic was interesting in the fact that it was, we often cite the technological shift that happened and, everyone's flashbacks to online learning. But I think what was interesting for me was there was a sudden interest in theories of learning, which were, I'm not going to say noted for their absence, but a sort of resurgence in particularly things around flipped learning. And when people sort of realized that, oh, wow, people have been writing about flipped learning for the best part of 2 decades. And all of this kind of came to the fore again. You did see quite an interesting marriage between technology and pedagogical theory kind of have come back.
It was, for me, it was really reassuring, really a shift in the kind of, it was a really pleasing shift, because I think it felt like that was a gap, and how could you bridge that gap? So a publication that I've got under review is effectively thinking about how do we bridge that gap for teachers? What do we make the format of the training in order to support them to bridge the gap between technical knowledge and pedagogical knowledge? And for me, one of those things as well, one of the challenges that is that teachers haven't learned through technology themselves, and actually learning through technology yourself could be a really good route to developing those teacher cognitions, that practical pedagogical knowledge. Because if you look at, for example, Borg's work on language teacher cognition, it's clear from that research that while teachers receive pre-service, in-service training, and then learn more from their practice in classroom, a significant kind of influence on the way in which they teach is their own experience as a learner. And so we need to be thinking about tutors' own experience with technology and their own sort of everyday use and their experience with that as a learner, or giving them those experiences can be a useful route to thinking about how you use technology. So to just give an example of something, so I've never taught, well, I have this year taught with kind of got people to do wikis. So this kind of online collaborative writing. But it wasn't until when I was writing a grant bid with someone who wanted to use one of these tools that I started to realize, what the challenges might be in a classroom of doing that, because I was actively writing stuff, and it was just getting deleted. And so thinking about, it's not just about the technology, it is about the pedagogy as well. And I guess not just about the pedagogy there. Clearly, it's about classroom management. It's about how you manage those social interactions in the classroom.
Yeah. Did you get any really neat original ideas from some of the data you were collecting of like applications? How are people using this to really aid learning? And
well, I got a really great vignette for like a stimulus for a workshop on this thinking about assessment. So a tutor who'd worked through writing an essay with a student, and then at the end of it, a certain proportion was AI written, a certain proportion was human written, and a certain proportion was like a collaborative where it had been edited. So I think that was really useful. In terms of uses of technology, a lot talked about the potential for chatbots, so for personal assistants. I think some of the interesting things were really identifying prompts as a new genre of language, and the potential to use prompts for teaching different language points. So using prompts to teach descriptive adjectives, I think it was. So it was like you could prompt DALL-E, so an image generator. And so you could use that as like a context for teaching, teaching vocabulary. There was also, so for a kind of slightly different point of view, thinking about, we obviously we need to raise students' AI literacy. The idea that actually using image generators, that could actually be a more salient way to show students the limitations of automatic, this generative AI, because you can visually see the kind of the infelicities, the misunderstandings that the algorithm is making about the real world. Whereas if you're asking them it to automatically generate a text on Vygotsky, Chomsky, then you've got to understand deep nuance to see where the AI is getting it wrong.
Yeah, I toyed with an activity that myself. I got students to use an image generator and try and, via the prompt, recreate an image from their favorite movie. And then you realize that how off-piste it goes, with minimal prompting from yourself. And
yeah, so I've toyed with them for like generating things for at home, for like making lino cut images. So I could then, novel images I could lino cut, and also using, so my son at school had used Udio to automatically generate songs. And that sort of separate to, what the tutors have suggested. I thought, well, actually that's really could be quite good of demonstrating almost the lack of creativity and the derivativeness of what these kind of generative AI, ChatGPT generates, because, it's just like it's quite good at making a disco jingle or something that sounds like, I don't know, Megadeth or something like that. But if you're looking for something original, then that's not what you're going to get. And what we want from students, particularly at master's level, is we want critical thinking. We want original thinking.
Yeah. So are you, I'm going to ask you about how, your own practice, but you introduced yourself as a researcher just now. But you teach as well. Are you primarily a researcher?
I'm on what they call an ART contract. So I teach and I research. So I teach, to be honest, I've taught mainly research methods. So I am a researcher. I also teach a module on teaching and learning with technology, and another module which is for pre-doctoral students on interdisciplinary, kind of doing interdisciplinary research. So kind of these differences across disciplines.
So do you use any of this, the things that we're talking about students doing? Have you messed with anything like using ChatGPT as a writing partner, helping to brainstorm structures? Is that a feature of yours?
I haven't done that yet. And the reason, so what I wanted to do last year was actually to bring it into the module more. I mean, this is kind of related to the assessment policy, to bring it into module, to get students to, so I do a bit on AI literacy, and to actually let them, for my module, write their essay using AI, but to have a separate part of the essay which is reflecting on their experience of use. So, but it was felt that was too risky, in that it might promote its use and practices across the wider cohort. I think the mood has changed, and I will be doing that this year. So in terms of really experimenting with it myself for these purposes, I haven't done so as much yet. I do, through the module, get them to have a go at doing kind of wikis, blog. I use kind of journals. Yeah, but I don't necessarily. I think for me, the way in which I think about using technology in my teaching is I'm thinking about what kind of processes do I want the learners to engage in? And often that's discussion. So I do, because I'm working with international students, I do use the kind of apps where you can pop Post-it notes. So they've got time to think themselves, to write. So because they're quite, often quite anxious to speak, to kind of write their ideas, to pop ideas up on a board. And then I start to kind of talk around them, to kind of validate their ideas, and then try to draw kind of them more into the discussions. That would be how I would tend to be using technology. And during the pandemic for online teaching, it was about similarly trying with discussion boards to get them to share those ideas and to make it clear, you're expected to share an idea, but you're also expected to comment on other people's ideas, to kind of get as close to that classroom discussion as I could. So the things I teach need the classroom discussion, I think.
Yeah. I mean, how about as a writer? I mean, you write a lot. Are you tempted to...
So as a writer, I think the trouble is I'm too skeptical of it. So you can use these tools throughout the writing process. There are some, one of my PhD students who works at another institution was saying, oh, she could have gone to this course on using AI to help do her research, but she was like, but that's not right, is it? And I'm like, well, you can use AI, for example, to search for journal articles. And maybe that's all right. Summarize them? Oh, I'm not sure. There's nuance in there that you're going to miss to automatically generate your writing. I don't know. I'll probably have more to say on that in September. I'm going to MethodsCon in Manchester. So it's I think an ESRC funded event where people are sharing new approaches to futures methods. And it looks like quite a lot of those are AI, involve AI. I think for me that the issue is that I know that it is just really modeling patterns in words. There is no ontology. There is no understanding. The understanding of the world is an illusion, but that arises due to the fact that it knows what words co-occur with one another. I mean, it does I think you can use it for, template-like text. Yeah. So when I actually worked in France Telecom during my year abroad. There was someone at that point looking at text generation for responding to complaint letters and things like that. Those kind of template letters, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there is loads of stuff we can automate, but our work as a researcher and at the university is about thinking. And I'm not convinced these technologies can think. That's the essence of human intelligence is thinking. And they've got language competence, but can they think?
Yeah, I'm similar. I think they've got applications for the templated stuff that we, have to churn out sometimes. But I equally, I don't like the idea of using something like ChatGPT to give the impression that I've thought about something when I haven't, or that I've, to answer my emails for me. I can just see that not being
the closest
productive.
I'm now converted to using Grammarly. I think, it mainly because I've got something that needs quite a lot of heavy editing, and it seems to be quite good. But I don't want it to be generating the idea. And the other, it's not just as well about the fact that these are just word co-occurrences in the end. It's also the fact that it can't summarize the latest research. It can't. You're going to have to do that the last 5 years, which is really what we want people to be talking about. You've got to do that yourself. Yes.
A couple of questions just to close off. I appreciate we're on the hour mark, and this is there's so many directions we can go in this. But you meant just to pick your thoughts. I almost said delve.
Yeah, that's in my data. Delve is in my data. I'm not. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the distance between research and classroom practice? You mentioned earlier, I think that's something you said that suggested you feel there's a bit of a gap at the moment. I certainly know some institutions where they're, even with things like they're researching EAP, who don't, and the departments are very separate. They don't really talk to each other. What's your sense here of
I mean, it does. So I'm interested in doing research in schools, and certainly I've experienced that there's quite a gap there. Unfortunately, I think when you're doing research on education, you're trying to do research with people who are extremely busy. Our colleagues who teach PGCE, our teachers are extremely busy. It's really difficult. But I think we do need to move to more sort of co-produced research. I mean, that's a general direction with research anyway. And I think that's really important so that the research we do is close to practice. So, for example, with educational technology, there is loads of research. You'll see funded projects on, I'm looking at a picture right now of some VR probably, of VR, I can't remember what it's called, immersive technologies. But how long is it going to be till these things are in our classrooms? we need to be looking, doing research as well on the technologies that are in our classrooms to enable good practices to disseminate. And so in order to do that, we need to be co-producing these things with teachers. I mean, I'd really like to do in that area a project that not just looks at teachers, but looks at kind of the management within schools and wider influences within the education system, because it's an ecosystem that's influencing what happens there. So I do think, there is a gap. And there's more a gap in the UK than, say, other countries. I was talking to someone in Taiwan who'd contributed to a British Council report on AI. And it was really interesting to understand how sort of government, things like the DFE, the equivalent of the DFE, and universities and teacher training organizations just seem to be, for want of a better word, more joined up. They were talking to one another in a way that perhaps we're not, we don't do as well in this country.
Mm. Yeah. As a final question, I was just I think you've sort of touched on this in that answer as well, but I was going to ask you about some sort of exciting opportunities in the field of like AI and education and, what you see happening. We tend to get bogged down in conversations around assessment and it becomes a bit dispiriting, but what do you see as, apart from practitioner researchers talking to each other and getting stuck in a bit more, what are the big sort of bright lights, you think?
So I recently was asked to give a talk at the Wales Policy Forum for Wales, and it was interesting what you're saying. The talk there is not so much about assessment, it's about ethics. Ethics is a big issue because of all of the data. But for me, as I said, I come to this, the idea is, how can we harness technology to support learning? And at the heart of AI technologies, what it means to be human is to use language. And we've got loads of advances in language technologies. And I think there are two big challenges, not so much EAP, though these applications could also be used in EAP. One of them is literacy. I think these technologies could be harnessed to develop personalized, individualized reading tutors. So like someone that can listen to you read, can give you feedback, but also the technology could be used to select text, to personalize text, to create things a bit like read your own adventure. So I think that there's a big possibility there. And, there are problems with kind of literacy levels. Think about there's a report on the prison population that actually reading instruction in prisons is practically absent. And this, there are potential solutions there via technology. And then the other one for me, thinking about language uptake, so modern foreign languages in schools, so children now, you learn languages at primary school, but they kind of get frustrated that they're not yet able to speak. And so it might be good if we could have these kind of like somehow harness existing chatbots, build on them to give children that individualized speaking practice. Both of these, I'm sure, are solutions that could be applied to kind of higher up in tertiary education as well. But I think specifically for schools, for generally for developing these tools, we need interdisciplinary collaborations. The UK is great at the underpinning technology, but translating AI into applications needs us to bring together sort of diverse teams and to translate learning theory into designs for these technologies, because learning theories are often quite sort of broad. The other thing, if we're thinking about children, is that we need to collect the data. Children's voices are not represented. And also, given the state of we don't yet have what they call general artificial intelligence. So an AI that can just do any task. Your algorithm needs to be trained on data for the task that you want it to do. And so whether this be learners in schools or whether it be developing the reading tutor and the conversational partner for EAP students in higher education, we're going to need to collect that data. And again, that's going to need collaboration. So I think that there needs to be funding for the data collection initially, but also for these kind of interdisciplinary collaborations that could harness AI to address what I see, for example, literacy, reading, which are really crucial issues to address to enable people to participate in society.
Fantastic. On that note, Dr. Zoe Handley, thank you very much for joining us. And the headphones are weighing heavy on our ears now, so we're going to call it a day. But I will put links to everything that we've discussed below, including all your recent articles. We look forward to seeing how this project goes in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.